She lived a quiet life that most people would never notice. In a small neighborhood where everyone seemed to know each other, she was simply one of many familiar faces. Someone who passed by with a soft smile. Someone who kept to herself. Someone who never tried to stand out. If people spoke about her, it was usually in passing. They would say she was polite, respectful, and calm, but no one ever described her as remarkable. Her days followed a simple rhythm. She woke up early, helped around the house, and spent most of her time either reading or sitting near the old piano in the corner of the living room. The piano wasn't new or impressive. Its surface had small scratches, and some of the keys had faded slightly over time. But to her, it was more than just an instrument. It was a quiet companion. She never played loudly. Even when she was alone, her fingers moved gently across the keys, as if she was afraid to disturb the silence around her. The music she played wasn't meant for an audience. It was something personal, something she kept close to herself. It reflected her thoughts in a way words never could. Very few people had ever heard her play. Sometimes, when guests visited, they would notice the piano and casually ask if anyone in the house played. She would usually stay quiet, letting others answer. And the answer was always the same. She plays a little, just for herself. People would nod politely, not thinking much of it. No one ever asked her to perform. No one expected anything beyond a little, and she never corrected them. One afternoon, as the sun filtered softly through the windows, she was sitting at the piano again. Her hands moved slowly, carefully, as if each note mattered more than the last. There was a calm focus in her eyes, the kind that comes from being completely present in a moment. For her, time seemed to slow down when she played. But that quiet moment didn't last long. A voice called her name from the other room. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keys for a second before gently lowering her hands. The sound of footsteps approached, and soon someone stood beside her with an expression that carried a mix of curiosity and urgency. "There's going to be a small gathering this weekend," the voice said. "Nothing too big, just a few people from the community." She listened quietly, her attention shifting from the piano to the conversation. "They're planning a simple program," the voice continued. "Some light performances, nothing serious. And they need someone to play the piano." She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes dropped slightly, and for a moment, it seemed like she was already searching for a way to avoid what was coming next. "They suggested you." The words hung in the air. She looked up, clearly surprised. "Me? Yes, it's just a simple tune. Nothing complicated. They don't expect anything big." That last part was meant to reassure her, but somehow it carried a different weight. It wasn't just reassurance, it was expectation. A small one, but an expectation nonetheless. She hesitated. In her mind, many thoughts began to form at once. She wasn't used to playing in front of people. The idea alone made her uneasy. It wasn't fear of making mistakes. It was something deeper. It was the feeling of being seen, of having attention placed on her when she had spent so long avoiding it. "I don't think I'm the right person," she said softly. But the response came quickly. "It's just a simple piece. Anyone could play it. You'll be fine. Anyone could play it." Those words settled in her mind, quietly but firmly. She turned her gaze back to the piano. The keys looked the same as they always had, but now they felt different. The space around her felt different too. What had always been a private world was suddenly being open to others. "You don't have to do anything special," the voice added. "Just something short. It'll be over quickly." She stayed silent for a moment longer. Then, almost without realizing it, she nodded. "Okay." It wasn't a confident answer. It wasn't filled with excitement. It was simply acceptance. And just like that, everything changed. Over the next few days, the small gathering became a quiet presence in her thoughts. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was always there, lingering in the background. Every time she sat at the piano, she became more aware of what she was playing. The notes felt more deliberate, more careful. She tried to keep things simple just as they had asked. A basic tune. Something light. Something that wouldn't draw too much attention. But no matter how hard she tried to keep it simple, Something inside her wouldn't allow it to feel ordinary. Her connection to the music ran deeper than that. Even when she played the simplest notes, there was a feeling behind them. A quiet emotion that she couldn't turn off. It wasn't something she practiced. It was just part of who she was. Still, she kept reminding herself, it's just a small gathering. Meanwhile, word about the event spread among the people who planned to attend. It wasn't anything grand, just a casual get-together. A chance for people to relax, talk, and enjoy a few light performances. When her name came up as the one who would play the piano, the reactions were mixed. Some people were indifferent, some were mildly curious, and a few were quietly doubtful. She plays? Someone asked. A little, came the reply. Oh, they said, as if that explained everything. No one expected anything memorable. To them, it was just another small part of the evening. Something to fill a gap in the program. Something polite. Back at home, she continued her quiet practice. There were moments when she stopped playing entirely, her hands resting still on her lap. In those moments, her thoughts would drift. She would imagine the room, the people, the attention, and then she would take a slow breath and place her fingers back on the keys. She didn't practice to impress anyone. She practiced because it was the only way she knew how to feel steady again. As the day of the gathering grew closer, there was a subtle change in her. It wasn't something others could easily notice. But inside, something was shifting. The hesitation was still there, but alongside it, there was something else, a quiet determination. She didn't talk about it. She didn't show it. But it was there. The night before the event, she sat at the piano longer than usual. The room was silent except for the soft sound of the keys. The music flowed gently, filling the space without demanding attention. For a moment, she closed her eyes. And in that moment, it didn't feel like practice anymore. Felt like something real, something honest. When she finally stopped, she let the last note fade completely before lifting her hands. She didn't rush away. She just sat there, taking in the quiet. Tomorrow she would play in front of others. Tomorrow she would step into a space she had always avoided. But for now, it was still just her and the piano. And that was enough. The morning of the gathering arrived more quickly than she expected. It didn't feel like a special day when she first opened her eyes. The light coming through the window looked the same. The sounds outside were the same as always. For a brief moment, she almost forgot what was waiting for her. Then it came back. Not all at once, but slowly, like a quiet reminder settling into her thoughts. She sat up and stayed still for a while, her hands resting in her lap. There was no panic, no sudden rush of fear, just a quiet awareness that something unfamiliar was going to happen. The house felt a little different that day. There was a soft sense of movement, like everything was gently shifting toward the evening. People spoke a little more than usual. There were small preparations happening, even though the event wasn't being held there. It was as if the idea of the gathering had already entered the space. She tried to keep her routine normal. She helped with small tasks, moved from one room to another, and avoided thinking too far ahead. But every now and then, her mind returned to the same thought. She would be playing in front of people. Not just playing. Being watched. That part felt unfamiliar. By the afternoon, she found herself sitting in front of the piano again. It had become her place to think, even when she wasn't trying to. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, but she didn't press them right away. Instead, she looked at them. Each key felt known to her. She knew how they would respond, how they would sound, how much pressure each one needed. There was comfort in that. No surprises, no expectations. She began to play slowly. The tune she had chosen was simple, just as they had asked. The notes were clear and easy to follow. Anyone listening would recognize it as something familiar, something safe. But as she played, she noticed something. Even though the tune was simple, the way she felt while playing it wasn't. There was a quiet weight behind each note. A kind of meaning that wasn't written in the music itself. Came from somewhere else, somewhere deeper. She didn't know how to separate it. She didn't know how to make it just simple. She paused halfway through. Her fingers stayed on the keys, but the music stopped. Is this too much? She wondered quietly. Not out loud, just in her thoughts. She had been told to keep it simple, to not do anything special, to treat it like a small moment. But for her, music had never been small. She took a slow breath and started again. This time trying to hold back, trying to keep the notes lighter, more controlled, less expressive. It worked for a few seconds. Then, without realizing it, she slipped back into her natural way of playing. She stopped again. A small sigh escaped her, barely noticeable. She wasn't trying to stand out. That wasn't her goal. In fact, it was the opposite. She wanted to do exactly what was expected and nothing more. But something inside her didn't follow those rules. As the day moved forward, time seemed to pass both quickly and slowly at the same time. Before she knew it, it was almost evening. The moment was getting closer. She got ready quietly, choosing something simple to wear. Nothing bright, nothing that would draw attention. She didn't want people to notice her before she even reached the piano. When she finally stepped outside, the air felt cooler. The sky had begun to change color, moving gently toward night. It was the kind of evening that felt calm on the surface. Inside her, though, there was a quiet tension building. Not fear, just pressure. The gathering was being held in a nearby hall. It wasn't large, but it was big enough to hold a decent number of people. As she approached, she could already hear soft voices and light laughter coming from inside. People had arrived early. She paused for a moment before entering. Just 1 second. Then she stepped in. The room was warm and softly lit. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, with a small open space at the front where the piano had been placed. It stood there quietly, waiting, just like she had been earlier in the day. A few people noticed her as she entered. Some nodded politely. Some gave small smiles. Others barely looked at her at all. She moved through the room carefully, keeping her presence as light as possible. She didn't want to interrupt anything. She didn't want to draw attention. In a way, she hoped she could just blend into the background until her turn came. Near the side of the room, a small group of people were talking. As she passed by, she caught a few words. That's the one who's playing tonight. Really? She seems quiet. Well, it's just a simple tune anyway. A soft chuckle followed. It should be fine. She didn't stop walking. She didn't react. But the words stayed with her. Not in a painful way, but in a clear, noticeable way. Confirmed what she already knew. No one expected much. She found a seat near the back and sat down quietly. From there, she could see the piano clearly. It didn't look intimidating. It looked familiar. That helped. The event began with small introductions. Nothing formal. Just a few words from the organizers, welcoming everyone and explaining the plan for the evening. Then the performances started. One by one, people went up and shared something. A short speech. A light story. A simple performance. The atmosphere remained relaxed, just as promised. There was polite clapping after each one. Nothing intense. Nothing overwhelming. As she watched, she noticed something interesting. Everyone else seemed comfortable being seen. They walked to the front without hesitation. They spoke or performed, then returned to their seats with ease. For her, the idea of walking up there felt completely different. It wasn't about the performance itself. It was about the moment of stepping into view. As time passed, her turn came closer. She could feel it without needing to check. It was like a quiet signal building inside her, growing stronger with each passing minute. Her hands rested in her lap, still and calm on the outside. But inside, there was movement. Memories of her practice. The sound of the notes. The feeling of the keys under her fingers. She focused on those things, letting them steady her. Then, finally, her name was called. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a simple announcement. But in that moment, everything seemed to pause. She stood up slowly. For a brief second, she considered what it would feel like to sit back down, to let the moment pass. But she didn't. She took a step forward. Then another. The room didn't fall completely silent, but the noise softened. A few people turned their heads. Some adjusted in their seats. She walked toward the piano with steady steps, even though her heart had begun to beat a little faster. When she reached the front, she paused. Just for a moment. Then she sat down. The bench felt firm beneath her. The piano was right in front of her, exactly where it needed to be. She placed her hands gently on her lap. The room was waiting, not with excitement, not with high expectations, just waiting. She lifted her hands slowly and placed her fingers on the keys. They felt familiar. That helped more than anything else. She took a quiet breath, and for a brief moment, everything around her faded. The room, the people, the whispers, all of it. There was only the piano, and the next note she was about to play. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, but for a moment, she didn't press them. The room was quiet in a soft, casual way, not the kind of silence that demands attention, but the kind that waits without expectation. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone near the back cleared their throat. It felt like just another small pause in an ordinary evening. She could feel her heartbeat, steady but present. It wasn't overwhelming. It didn't rush her. It simply reminded her that this moment was real. Her eyes stayed on the piano, not on the people, not on the room, just the keys. She had sat in front of a piano like this many times before. The difference was that today, there were people behind her. Today, there was an audience, even if they weren't fully paying attention yet. She took a slow breath. Then, gently, she pressed the first key. The sound was soft, clear, simple. It didn't demand anything from the room. It didn't try to impress. It was just a single note played with care. A few people looked up, almost out of habit. She played the next note, and then another. The melody began to form, slowly, piece by piece. It was the same simple tune she had practiced. Nothing complicated. Nothing unexpected. At least that's how it started. Her hands moved carefully, as if she was guiding each note into place. There was no rush in her playing. Each sound had space to breathe before the next one arrived. In the audience, some people were still distracted. A few leaned back in their chairs, relaxed. One or two exchanged quiet comments with the person beside them. But something subtle was beginning to shift. It wasn't obvious yet. Not something you could point to. Just a small change in the way the room felt. Her touch on the keys was gentle but steady. There was a quiet confidence in it, even if she didn't fully feel it inside. It came from familiarity, from years of playing without thinking about being watched. She wasn't trying to perform. She was just playing. And that made a difference. As the melody continued, a few more heads turned toward her. The soft background sounds in the room began to fade. Not all at once, but gradually. It was the tone of the music. There was something about it. Something calm but also deep. Even though the tune was simple, the way she played it carried more than just the notes. There was a feeling behind it. Something that didn't need words. She didn't notice the shift happening around her. Her focus stayed on the piano. Her fingers moved more freely now, no longer as cautious as before. The hesitation that had been there at the beginning started to fade, replaced by something more natural. She leaned slightly into the music, almost without realizing it. The notes became smoother, more connected, each one leading into the next without effort. In the audience, the small conversations stopped. Not because anyone asked them to. They just stopped. People who had been only half listening now found themselves paying attention. It wasn't a sudden realization. It was more like they slowly became aware that they were listening. One person who had been looking at their phone lowered it. Another, who had been leaning back casually, sat up a little straighter. There was no dramatic moment. No big change. Just a quiet shift in attention. At the piano, she continued to play. Her breathing had slowed. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. She wasn't thinking about the audience anymore. She wasn't thinking about expectations. She wasn't even thinking about the fact that this was supposed to be just a simple tune. She had stepped into something familiar. Something she understood without needing to explain it. The music. There was a moment where her fingers paused very briefly between notes. Not a mistake. Not hesitation. Just a natural pause, like a breath in the middle of a sentence. And in that small pause, the room felt it. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Then the next note came, soft but certain. And it held the room in place. By now, almost everyone was looking at her. Not in a heavy or intense way, but with quiet attention. Even those who had expected nothing more than a short, forgettable performance were now listening more closely. Some didn't even realize why. They just knew something felt different. Her playing hadn't become louder. It hadn't become more complex. But it had become deeper, more expressive. There was a kind of honesty in it, something that felt real and unforced. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't trying to prove anything. And maybe that's what made it stand out. Her fingers moved with more confidence now. The small uncertainties from the beginning had disappeared completely. In their place was a calm flow, steady and natural. It was as if the music was guiding her, not the other way around. Each note landed exactly where it needed to. Each pause felt right. Time in the room seemed to slow down. No one was checking how long it had been. No one was waiting for it to end. They were simply there, listening. A person near the front leaned slightly forward, resting their elbows on their knees, completely focused. Another, sitting toward the side, had a soft expression on their face, as if the music had taken them somewhere else for a moment. Even those who had quietly doubted her earlier now watched without judgment. The idea of a simple tune had faded. This didn't feel simple anymore. Felt meaningful. At the piano, she continued without interruption. Her hands moved across the keys with ease now, no longer held back by the awareness of being watched. The room had disappeared from her mind completely. There was only the sound, only the feeling, only the connection between her and the instrument. If someone had asked her in that moment what she was thinking, she wouldn't have had an answer. She wasn't thinking. She was just playing. And somehow that reached everyone in the room. The melody continued, gentle but steady, carrying something deeper with every passing note. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was enough. More than enough. And without anyone announcing it, without any clear moment marking the change, the room had shifted completely. What started as a small, overlooked part of the evening had quietly become something else. Something no one had expected. Something no one wanted to interrupt. And she was still playing, unaware that the very thing she had tried to keep small was slowly becoming the most important moment of the night. The music continued, flowing gently through the room, but now it felt different from when it had begun. What started as a simple tune had slowly taken on a life of its own. The notes were still soft, still controlled, but there was a quiet strength behind them now, something steady and sure. She didn't notice when the shift fully happened, but everyone else did. The room had changed. The casual feeling from earlier was gone. The small distractions, the quiet whispers, the half-hearted attention, none of it remained. In its place was a stillness that felt deeper, more focused. It wasn't forced silence. It was chosen. People wanted to listen. At the piano, she sat with calm focus, her fingers moving with ease across the keys. The hesitation that had once lived in her hands had completely disappeared. There was no sign of doubt anymore. No second-guessing. She had settled into the music completely. Each note connected to the next in a way that felt natural, almost effortless. It wasn't about playing perfectly. It was about feeling every sound as it passed through her. Her posture remained simple, her movements gentle, but there was a quiet confidence in the way she played now. It wasn't something she was trying to show. It was just there. The melody began to open up more. It was still the same tune, but it felt fuller, richer, like it had grown beyond its original shape. The small piece that people expected had become something more expressive, more alive. A person sitting near the front slowly leaned back in their chair, their eyes fixed on her hands. They had come to the event expecting a relaxed evening, something easy to pass the time. But now they weren't thinking about time at all. Another person who had earlier made a quiet comment about the performance being just simple, now sat completely still, their earlier assumptions fading without a word. There was no need to say anything. The music was answering everything. Her fingers moved with a steady rhythm, sometimes light, sometimes slightly stronger, but always controlled. She didn't rush through the piece. She gave it space, allowing each note to settle before moving on. That space mattered. It gave the room time to feel what she was playing. There was a moment when her left hand slowed slightly, creating a softer foundation, while her right hand carried the melody forward. The contrast added depth, pulling the listeners in even more. Someone in the audience took a quiet breath, almost in sync with the music. It wasn't something they planned. It just happened. The connection in the room had become real. Not loud, not overwhelming, but clear. At the piano, she remained unaware of the effect she was creating. Her focus stayed inward, connected only to the sound beneath her fingers. The outside world had faded completely. If there had been noise, she wouldn't have heard it. If someone had called her name, she wouldn't have noticed. She was fully present in the music. Her hands moved slightly faster now, not in a rushed way, but with a natural flow that came from comfort. The tune, once simple and predictable, now carried small variations, subtle changes in timing and touch that made it feel personal. It wasn't something written on paper. It came from her. Each note carried a small piece of her feeling, her understanding of the music. And that made it different from anything the audience expected. The room responded without realizing it. People leaned forward slightly. I stayed fixed on her hands. Even the smallest movements of her fingers held attention. There was no longer any doubt about her. No quiet judgments. No low expectations. Those had all disappeared somewhere between the first few notes and now. What remained was respect. And something more. Something closer to admiration. Near the back, someone who had barely paid attention at the beginning now watched with full focus. Their expression had softened. Their posture changed. They weren't just hearing the music anymore. They were feeling it. The air in the room felt heavier, not in a negative way, but in a meaningful way. Like the moment carried weight, something important that couldn't be rushed or ignored. Her playing continued, steady and calm. There was a brief rise in the melody, a slight increase in energy, as if the music was building toward something. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. The room followed that rise without effort. Then, just as gently, the music softened again. It was like a quiet conversation, moving up and down, never losing its balance. She didn't force anything. She let it happen. And that made all the difference. A person sitting near the side of the room blinked slowly, as if they had been lost in thought and suddenly returned. But they hadn't really left the moment. They had just been drawn deeper into it. Time felt strange now. It didn't move the way it usually did. No one was counting minutes. No one was waiting for the next part of the program. Everything outside this moment had faded. There was only the music, and the feeling it carried. Her hands began to slow slightly, signaling that the piece was moving toward its final section. The notes became softer again, more delicate, but still full of meaning. The energy in the room didn't drop. If anything, it became more focused. People sensed that the end was approaching, and no one wanted to miss a single note. Her fingers pressed each key with care, as if she was placing something fragile into the air. The melody returned to its simplest form, echoing the way it had begun, but now it felt completely different. It had grown. It had changed. Just like the room, there was a quiet understanding among the listeners now. What they were hearing was not just a simple tune. It was something more, something real. At the piano, she remained calm, her breathing steady, her movements controlled. There was no sign of the hesitation that had once been there. Only presence, only focus, only music. And as the final notes began to take shape, the room held its breath without even realizing it, waiting for something they couldn't quite explain, but didn't want to end. The final part of the melody approached slowly, almost gently, as if the music itself was not in a hurry to leave. Her fingers moved with care, pressing each key with a softness that carried meaning. The sound filled the room, but it never felt loud. It stayed calm, steady, and clear. Everyone could feel that the end was close, but no one wanted it to arrive. The room had become so still that even the smallest sound felt noticeable. A chair shifting slightly, someone adjusting their hands, the faint sound of breathing. Yet none of these distractions broke the moment. The music held everything together. At the piano, she remained completely focused. Her eyes stayed on the keys, her posture relaxed, her movements controlled. There was no sign of nervousness anymore. The quiet hesitation from earlier had fully disappeared. She was no longer thinking about the audience. She was no longer thinking about expectations. She was simply finishing what she had started. The melody softened even more, returning to the same simplicity it had at the beginning. But now, every note carried a deeper feeling. It was no longer just a tune. It felt like a complete story, one that had slowly unfolded without anyone realizing it. A person sitting near the front leaned slightly forward, their attention fixed completely on her hands. Another person, sitting toward the back, held their breath without noticing. The air in the room felt still, full, almost heavy with quiet emotion. Her left hand slowed, giving space for the final notes to stand on their own. Her right hand moved gently, pressing each key with a careful touch, as if she didn't want to rush the ending. There was no rush, no pressure, just a natural closing. One note followed another, each one softer than the last. The sound seemed to linger in the air longer now, stretching the moment just a little more. Felt like time had slowed down completely. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even thought about what would come next. They were all there, inside the last few seconds of something they didn't want to lose. Her fingers pressed the final note. Soft, clear. And then, she lifted her hands. The sound didn't disappear immediately. It stayed for a moment, fading slowly into silence. That silence felt just as important as the music itself. No one clapped. Not right away. The room remained completely still. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was something deeper. People needed a moment to come back, a moment to understand what they had just experienced. Her hands rested lightly in her lap now. She stayed seated, not moving, not looking up. It was as if she was still connected to the music, even though it had ended. She took a quiet breath, and in that small, natural movement something shifted. The silence broke. At first it was just one person. A single clap, soft but clear. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the room filled with applause. But this wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't something done out of habit. It was real, strong, genuine. People clapped with energy, with feeling, with a kind of appreciation that didn't need words. Some leaned forward as they clapped, others nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something they hadn't expected. The sound of the applause grew, filling the room in a way completely different from the music, but just as powerful. She looked up slowly. For the first time since she had started playing, she allowed herself to see the audience. What she saw was not what she expected. There was no indifference, no quiet judgment, no low expectations. Instead, there were faces filled with respect, with surprise, with admiration. Some people had small smiles, others had thoughtful expressions, as if they were still processing what they had just heard. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. She didn't react in a big way. She didn't stand up quickly or make any bold gestures. She simply gave a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the applause, and slowly stood up from the bench. The clapping continued for a few more moments, then gradually softened. But the feeling in the room didn't disappear. It stayed. She stepped away from the piano, her movements calm and natural. There was no rush in the way she walked. No need to escape the moment. But she didn't try to stay in it either. She moved toward her seat quietly, just as she had walked to the front earlier. As she passed by, a few people looked at her differently now. Not just as someone who had played a simple tune, but as someone who had done something meaningful, something unexpected. She returned to her seat and sat down gently, her hands resting once again in her lap. Her breathing was steady, her expression calm. Inside, though, there was a quiet shift. Not excitement, not pride in a loud way, just a sense of stillness. A sense that something had happened, something important, even if she couldn't fully describe it. Around her, The event slowly began to continue. The next part of the program was introduced, and someone else prepared to go to the front. But the energy in the room had changed. People were still present, still listening. But a part of their attention remained with what had just happened. A few quiet conversations started again, but they were different now. Softer, more thoughtful. "She didn't just play," someone whispered. Another person nodded slightly. "No, that was something else." Near the side of the room, someone who had earlier made a small, doubtful comment now sat quietly, their expression more serious than before. They didn't speak, but their silence said enough. The piano remained at the front, unchanged, but it didn't feel like just an instrument anymore. Felt like it had been part of something larger. She didn't look back at it. She didn't need to. She had already given what she came to give. And somehow, without trying, without planning, without expecting anything, she had changed the entire room. Not with something loud. Not with something complicated. But with something simple, honest, and real. And even as the evening moved forward, that feeling stayed behind, quietly present, like an echo that refused to fade. The rest of the evening continued, but it didn't feel the same as before. People still listened to the next performances, they still clapped, they still smiled and spoke to each other. On the surface, everything moved forward just as planned. But something had quietly shifted in the room, and it didn't fade easily. She sat in her seat, calm and still, as if nothing unusual had happened. Her hands rested gently in her lap, the same way they had before she went to the piano. Her posture was relaxed, her expression soft. If someone had looked at her without knowing what she had just done, they might not have noticed anything different. But people did know, and they couldn't ignore it. From time to time, someone would glance in her direction. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a thoughtful way, as if they were still trying to understand the quiet impact of her performance. Some people exchanged looks with each other, small nods that carried silent agreement. No one said anything loudly. No one made a big scene. But the respect was there, clear and steady. As the final part of the event came to an end, people slowly began to stand, stretching slightly, adjusting their clothes, preparing to leave. The room filled with soft conversation again, but it felt warmer now, more connected. She stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the movement happen around her. She didn't rush. She didn't feel the need to leave quickly. She simply waited until the crowd thinned a little. Then she stood up. Her steps were quiet as she moved toward the exit. She didn't try to draw attention. That wasn't who she was. Even after everything, she remained the same person who had walked into the room earlier that evening. But as she walked, something unexpected happened. Someone gently stepped into her path. Not to stop her in a harsh way, but just enough to speak. That was beautiful. The words were simple, spoken with sincerity. No exaggeration, no dramatic tone, just honest appreciation. She paused, slightly surprised. "Thank you," she replied softly. It wasn't a long conversation. It didn't need to be, but it was real. As she continued walking, another person gave her a small smile and nodded. Someone else quietly said, "You played really well." Each comment was short, simple, but meaningful. She responded the same way each time, with a quiet thank you, never making more of it than necessary. She didn't seem overwhelmed by the attention, but she also didn't ignore it. She accepted it calmly, without changing her natural way of being. Outside, the air felt cooler than before. The night had settled in fully now. The sounds of the gathering faded behind her as she stepped away from the building. For a moment she stopped. She didn't look back. She simply stood there, feeling the calm of the night around her. There was no noise, no applause, no eyes watching her, just silence. The same kind of silence she was used to, and in that silence, everything felt clear again. She began to walk home slowly, her steps unhurried. The path was familiar, the same one she had taken many times before. Nothing about it had changed, but something inside her had. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that demanded attention. Just a quiet shift. A deeper understanding. She thought about the moment she had sat at the piano. The first note. The way the room had slowly grown still. The way the music had carried something beyond what she had planned. She hadn't tried to impress anyone. She hadn't tried to prove anything. She had simply played the way she always did. And somehow that had been enough. More than enough. As she reached home, the door opened with a soft sound. The familiar space welcomed her back without question. Everything was just as she had left it earlier that day. Nothing had changed. And yet, it didn't feel exactly the same. She walked over to the piano without thinking. It stood quietly in its place, just as it always had. For a moment, she simply looked at it. Then she sat down. Her hands rested gently on her lap before slowly moving to the keys. She didn't plan to play anything specific. No practice, no preparation, just a simple touch. Her fingers pressed a single note. Soft, clear. The sound filled the room, just like it had before. But this time, there was no audience. No expectations. No pressure. Just her. And the music. She played a few more notes, letting them flow naturally. Felt different, but also the same. The connection was still there, steady and quiet. She realized something in that moment. The music had never changed. It had always been like this. It was the same sound, the same feeling, the same honesty. The only difference was that now, others had heard it too. And they had understood. She stopped playing after a short while, letting the last note fade into the quiet space around her. Her hands remained on the keys for a moment before she gently pulled them back. There was no need to play more. The moment felt complete. Days passed after the event, and life returned to its usual rhythm. She continued her routine, moving through each day with the same calm presence as before. But something had shifted in how people saw her. When she walked through the neighborhood, the small nods and greetings felt slightly different. There was a hint of recognition now, a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. Some people mentioned the performance in passing. That night was special, someone said one afternoon. You should play more often, another suggested. She listened, smiled politely, but didn't make any promises. She didn't feel the need to change anything. She didn't start seeking attention. She didn't begin performing regularly. She remained who she had always been. But now people knew. They understood that behind her quiet nature, there was something deeper, something real, something meaningful. And that understanding stayed with them. Even if they didn't talk about it often. Even if life moved on. They remembered. Back at home, the piano remained her place of comfort. She continued to play as she always had. Not for an audience, not for recognition, but because it was part of her. The world outside could be loud, full of expectations and opinions. But at the piano, everything was simple again. Just sound. Just feeling. Just truth. And maybe that was the quiet lesson she left behind that night. That brilliance doesn't always come from trying to be seen. Sometimes it comes from being true to what you are, even when no one is watching. And when the moment finally arrives, it speaks for itself.